Welcome back to Not the Right, the podcast where we pull no punches in addressing the world's injustices. I'm Natasha.
And I'm Nick. Today's episode is going to be heavy, so buckle up. We're diving into the latest escalation of violence in the Middle East, specifically Israel's killing of Hezbollah's leader, Hassan Nasrallah, and the devastating toll it's taking on Lebanon. Hundreds of innocent civilians have been murdered or maimed in the crossfire, and the situation is only getting worse.
Nick, the stats from just this past week are gut-wrenching. On Monday, September 23rd alone, at least 558 people were killed in Israeli attacks across Lebanon, including 50 children and 94 women. More than 1,800 people were injured, and this was just in a single day. The Lebanese Health Ministry has confirmed these numbers. Israel announced the start of Operation Northern Arrows that day, and what followed was an indiscriminate assault on civilians.
Monday, September 23rd, marked the deadliest day in Lebanon since the end of the country's civil war back in 1990. It's staggering, and the attacks didn't stop there. Scores more have been killed in the following days. Right now, nearly 500,000 people have been displaced from South Lebanon, the Bekaa Valley, and other regions under bombardment.
Let that sink in. 500,000 people forced to flee their homes in a matter of days. These are civilians, many of them women and children, running from airstrikes, bombings, and chaos. And it's all happening with US support. This is where we need to call it what it is. Israel's actions are war crimes, and the United States is helping them commit those war crimes by proxy.
Yeah, and what's happening on the other side? Hezbollah has retaliated with attacks on northern Israel, and while the casualties aren't nearly on the same scale, it's still significant. Israeli media reported that at least 15 people have been injured, mostly by shrapnel or debris. Some were hurt while trying to access shelters. In response to the fighting, about 63,000 residents in northern Israel have been displaced since last October.
We're not excusing any violence here, but the scale of destruction in Lebanon is incomprehensible compared to what's happening in Israel. Israeli airstrikes are leveling entire neighborhoods, and it's civilians, children, women, the elderly, who are paying the price.
Right. When we look at the death toll from just one day, 558 people killed, 50 of them children, it's hard not to be outraged. This isn't about defending borders or counterterrorism. These are targeted attacks on areas where civilians live, work, and seek shelter.
And it's not happening in isolation. Israel has done this time and again in Gaza, in the West Bank, and now in Lebanon. And who's footing the bill? The United States. Billions of dollars in military aid go straight to Israel each year, money that's being used to fuel these very attacks. Our tax dollars are funding this violence.
Let's be clear about something. The U.S. isn't just a passive observer in this conflict. It's a key player. The weapons that Israel uses, from fighter jets to precision bombs, are largely provided by the United States. And these weapons aren't just sitting in storage. They're being used in real time to kill civilians.
What's worse, the international community watches, and the mainstream media often glosses over the true devastation. The narrative is always framed around Israel's right to defend itself. But what about Lebanon's right to exist? What about the right of Palestinian families to live without the fear of being bombed out of existence?
Exactly. The hypocrisy here is glaring. On Monday, when 558 people died, it was barely a blip in Western media. But when Hezbollah fires rockets, it's headline news. The imbalance is staggering. No one's saying that attacks on civilians in Israel should be ignored, but we need to acknowledge the disproportionate response. Lebanon is being torn apart.
And let's talk about the human impact beyond the death toll. Nearly 500,000 displaced in Lebanon, 500,000 people who are now refugees in their own country. Homes destroyed, schools bombed, hospitals overwhelmed. This is a humanitarian disaster, and it's largely ignored by those who could make a difference.
Not to mention, these attacks are happening under the guise of targeting Hezbollah. But the reality is that it's not just Hezbollah who's suffering. Innocent civilians, people who have nothing to do with this conflict, are being killed in the crossfire. You can't justify 50 dead children as collateral damage.
Meanwhile, the US government continues to send money and weapons to Israel, with little to no accountability. If the US wanted to stop these atrocities, they could. They have the leverage. They're Israel's biggest financial backer. But instead, they turn a blind eye to these war crimes, and we, as American citizens, are complicit.
It's maddening. We're watching the destruction of entire communities, and the world powers who could intervene refuse to act. Instead, they're helping. Every bomb dropped, every civilian killed. There's a direct line to Washington.
And the displacement on both sides is staggering. While we've seen 63,000 people displaced in northern Israel since last October, that's a fraction compared to the 500,000 displaced in Lebanon in just a few weeks. Both sides are suffering, but let's be honest, the scale of destruction in Lebanon is on another level.
This is a genocide happening in slow motion. We've said it before, and we'll say it again. This isn't about being anti-Israel or pro-Hezbollah. It's about recognizing human rights abuses for what they are. What Israel is doing to Lebanon and Palestine is genocide, and we can't afford to stay silent.
We're Natasha and Nick, and this has been Not the Right. As always, stay informed, stay outraged, and, most importantly, stay active. Call out injustice wherever you see it, and hold your governments accountable. We'll see you next time. If you want to learn more about what's happening and how you can help, check the links in the description. We've included resources for humanitarian aid in Lebanon and Palestine, and information on how to contact your representatives to demand an end to US military aid to Israel until these war crimes stop.